Trapped in his wrecked car, teetering on the edge of a ravine, the billionaire's breath caught as two figures approached, blades flashing under the moonlight. Certain his fate was sealed, he shut his eyes, but a savage roar ripped through the night as a massive dog charged from the shadows. A whirlwind of fury. Another delay? This is unacceptable. Ricardo's voice sliced through the air like a blade. He stood at the edge of his desk, glaring at the trembling young executive standing before him. The room was impeccably sterile. Polished glass walls, a mahogany desk unmarred by clutter, and the ever-present screens projecting the company's staggering financial growth. A man of 43, Ricardo Montero exuded power, but not the kind that inspired admiration. His was a power that pressed on others like an oppressive weight. The executive fumbled with the papers in his hand, stammering, "Sir, the new proposal. There were some delays in legal approvals. I assure you, it'll be ready by..." "By when?" Ricardo snapped, his eyes narrowing. "Every delay costs money. Costs me money. Do you think this company runs on apologies and assurances?" The young man nodded mutely, his face pale. "Out," Ricardo said, gesturing curtly to the door. "Fix it, or find yourself something less demanding. A lemonade stand, perhaps." The executive scurried out, and Ricardo sighed heavily, collapsing into his leather chair. He spun around to face the city skyline, his reflection in the glass a stark contrast to the bustling life below. To Ricardo, the world outside existed for one reason: profit. As his eyes scanned the horizon, the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Montero," Emilia's voice came through, steady and unflinching despite years of weathering his temper. "The charity gala is in an hour. Your mother left another message asking for confirmation that you'll be attending." Ricardo let out a sharp breath. "Tell her I'll be there for the speech and the photo ops. 30 minutes, tops." "You might want to consider staying longer," Emilia ventured, her tone cautious. "The Montero Foundation's new partnership could really use your presence. And people notice when you leave early." Ricardo smirked. "People notice the donations, Emilia, not the donor. I've already signed off on the transfer. Let them plaster my name on whatever they want. It's good PR. But wasting hours shaking hands with social climbers, that's their game, not mine." There was a brief pause. Then Emilia replied, "Understood, sir." Her tone carried a hint of disappointment, but Ricardo didn't care enough to address it. Later that evening, the gala unfolded in the gilded ballroom of one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and servers moved like shadows, offering champagne to a sea of silk and tuxedos. Ricardo strode in, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who knew he was the wealthiest person in the room. "Ricardo," his mother's voice called, warm yet firm. Victoria Montero stood by the podium, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She was every inch the dignified philanthropist, a stark contrast to her son's calculating demeanor. "Mother," Ricardo greeted, brushing a brief kiss on her cheek. "The foundation seems to be doing well. Another success under your belt." "It could do better," Victoria said, her piercing eyes meeting his. "With more of your time, that is. I'm here, aren't I?" Ricardo gestured to the room with a faint smile. "Signed the checks, made the donations. Isn't that enough?" "You've made a habit of thinking money solves everything," Victoria said, her voice low but cutting. "It doesn't." Ricardo's smirk faltered. "This again?" "I learned from the best, Mother. Or have you forgotten how Father ran things?" "Your father had his flaws, yes," Victoria replied, "but I've spent years trying to correct the damage he caused. And you, Ricardo, you've taken his worst qualities and sharpened them." "That's enough," Ricardo said, his voice hardening. You're welcome for the funding. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have people to greet." Victoria watched him walk away, her expression a mix of sadness and frustration. As the evening dragged on, Ricardo moved from one shallow conversation to another, exchanging pleasantries he didn't mean. Every smile was calculated, every handshake a transaction. It wasn't until he stood alone near the bar, swirling a glass of scotch, that the weight of the evening pressed on him. The laughter, the bright lights, the endless chatter, it all blurred together. For a moment, he felt it again, the gnawing emptiness he refused to acknowledge. "Beautiful event, isn't it?" A woman's voice broke through his thoughts. Ricardo turned to see Amelia, standing poised with a glass of champagne. She rarely attended these events unless necessary, and her presence now surprised him. "Didn't expect to see you here," Ricardo said. "Someone has to make sure you don't bolt before the photos," Amelia quipped, her smile faint. Ricardo chuckled dryly, though there was no warmth in it. "You know me too well." "Maybe," she said. Then after a pause, "But sometimes I think no one really knows you at all." Her words lingered as she walked away, leaving Ricardo alone once more. This time, the noise of the room felt louder, the brightness sharper. He downed his scotch and left, the applause for his mother's speech following him out like a ghost. Ricardo's shoes echoed against the polished marble floors of the hotel lobby as he made his way to the valet stand. The distant hum of the gala's chatter still vibrated in his ears, but it felt far away now, like an afterthought. The weight of the evening pressed on his chest, heavier than the scotch he'd just downed. He handed his ticket to the valet with a curt nod, his gaze flicking past the glass doors into the rain-slick street beyond. The valet brought his Aston Martin around quickly. A sleek, black machine that gleamed even in the dim, misty glow of the streetlights. Ricardo slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of leather and cologne wrapping around him. The door closed with a muted thud, shutting out the world behind him. He didn't bother turning on the radio. The sound of the engine roaring to life was enough. The rain began to fall harder as he pulled away, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers the only noise in the silence. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his mind running over the night's events. His mother's pointed words, Emilia's veiled disappointment, the applause that had chased him out of the ballroom. "They want a savior," he muttered to himself, the corner of his mouth twisting into a bitter smile. "I'm not in the business of saving anyone." His thoughts were interrupted by a flash in his rearview mirror. Headlights. Close. Too close. Ricardo frowned, his grip on the wheel tightening. The car behind him didn't pass, didn't slow. It stayed in his blind spot, unnervingly persistent. The rain fell harder, the road gleaming like oil under the streetlights. Ricardo took a sharp turn onto a quieter stretch of road, lined by trees that swayed and hissed in the wind. The headlights followed, cutting through the darkness with unrelenting precision. Something wasn't right. "Amateurs," he muttered, his voice low and clipped. Ricardo had dealt with threats before. Jealous competitors, disgruntled employees. He was no stranger to those who'd like to see him fail. But this felt different. His foot pressed harder on the gas, the engine growling in response as the speedometer crept higher. The car behind him matched his speed. Ricardo's pulse quickened, but he kept his face impassive, his mind calculating. He tapped the brakes lightly, testing the distance between his car and the one behind. Nothing. The brake pedal didn't respond. His heart slammed against his ribcage as he pressed harder. Still nothing. "Damn it," he hissed, his eyes darting to the dashboard. Warning lights flashed. Red, yellow, none of it good. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The steering wheel trembled in his hands as the car began to pick up speed, the incline of the road pulling him down faster and faster. Ahead, the trees loomed closer, the winding road disappearing into a black void. He wrestled with the wheel, trying to control the descent, but the car swerved wildly, tires skidding against the slick asphalt. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the wheel tighter, his breaths coming fast and shallow. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Ricardo saw a bend in the road ahead. Too sharp, too fast. "Hold on," he growled, though there was no one else to hear. The car hit the bend, the back wheels fishtailing. Ricardo fought the spin, but the Aston Martin veered off the road, plunging down an embankment. The world turned upside down as the car flipped, the sickening crunch of metal against earth filling his ears. When the car finally came to a stop, the silence was deafening. Ricardo blinked, his vision swimming. Pain lanced through his shoulder, and his legs were pinned by the crumpled dashboard. He fumbled with the seatbelt, but it wouldn't budge. His movements were frantic now, pulling at the strap across his chest. The air reeked of gasoline and wet earth. Through the rain and the fogged glass, he heard voices, and low, urgent, and coming closer. "Where is he?" one voice demanded, sharp and impatient. "He's got to be in the car," the other replied, his tone tinged with irritation. "Spread out. We don't have much time. Police will be here soon." Ricardo froze, his breath catching in his throat. The blood roared in his ears, louder than the pounding rain. "Make it quick," the first man barked. "No loose ends." Ricardo's mind raced, calculating his options. The seatbelt was jammed tight, and the twisted frame of the car pressed down on his legs like a vice. His fingers searched the dashboard, the seats, for anything he could use, but the wreckage was bare. Outside, the crunch of boots on wet leaves grew louder, closer. Ricardo's jaw clenched. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. This wasn't a hostile takeover or a corporate betrayal. This was life or death. He pressed his back against the seat, trying to will himself invisible as the beam of a flashlight sliced through the shattered windshield. "There," the second man said, his shadowed figure looming outside the car. Ricardo bit down on his lip, blood pooling as he suppressed a curse. For the first time in years, panic crept into his chest. The first man leaned closer, his face briefly illuminated by the light. "Montero!" he sneered, the name rolling off his tongue like venom. "End of the line." The flashlight flickered over Ricardo's face, blinding him. The first man lunged toward the overturned car, knife glinting in the faint light, but the growl that ripped through the air stopped him cold. Both men turned sharply, their bodies tense as a low snarl grew louder, closer. "What the hell is that?" the second man hissed, his crowbar raised. Before they could react further, a blur of fur and muscle erupted from the darkness. The dog, a large, imposing mutt with piercing eyes, lunged straight at the man nearest the car. Its teeth sank deep into his arm, eliciting a guttural scream as the knife clattered to the ground. "Get it off me!" he roared, thrashing violently, but the dog held firm, its growls reverberating like a primal war cry. The second man swung the crowbar with all his might, landing a brutal blow against the dog's side. A yelp of pain tore through the air, but the animal didn't release its grip. It only snarled louder, shaking its head viciously as blood sprayed from the man's torn arm. "You're going to pay for that! You damn mutt!" the second man bellowed, swinging again. This time, the crowbar connected with the dog's back legs, sending it sprawling to the ground. The first man stumbled back, cradling his injured arm, his face contorted in rage. "Kill it! Finish it off!" The dog struggled to stand, its body trembling, but it managed to rise on unsteady legs. Its eyes blazed with defiance as it faced the two men, its growls unrelenting despite the blood dripping from its fur. The second man advanced, raising the crowbar high. "Stupid beast!" he snarled, bringing it down hard. The dog twisted at the last second, avoiding the brunt of the blow, but letting out a sharp whine as the edge of the crowbar scraped across its ribs. Still, it refused to back down. It lunged again, this time targeting the man with the crowbar. Its teeth found his leg, biting down with enough force to buckle his stance. The man screamed, kicking at the dog with his free foot, but the animal's grip was iron. The first man, now pale and furious, grabbed the fallen knife with his good hand and lunged toward the dog. "I'll gut it!" he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. The knife came down, catching the dog along its side. Blood welled instantly, staining its dark fur, and the dog let out a heart-wrenching yelp. It staggered back, its legs nearly giving out. "Yeah, that's right," the man sneered, advancing with the knife again. "Die like the mangy—" A howl of sirens sliced through the night, distant but unmistakable. Both men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. "Cops!" the second man spat, panic flashing across his face. The first man cursed violently, his injured arm hanging limp at his side. "Damn it! We'll finish this later! Let's go!" The two men bolted into the trees, their curses and footsteps fading into the distance as the dog stood its ground, its body trembling but unyielding. Ricardo, still trapped in the car, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and disbelief. His breaths came shallow and quick as he looked at the animal, now turning its attention toward him. The dog limped to the wreckage, its movements labored, and began clawing at the shattered window. Despite the blood pouring from its wounds, it barked sharply, as if demanding Ricardo to move. Ricardo fumbled with the seatbelt again, desperation making his hands clumsy. The dog growled, gripping the strap with its teeth and pulling with all the strength it had left. The strap gave way with a snap, and Ricardo fell against the roof of the overturned car. The dog barked again, its tone insistent. "I'm trying," Ricardo muttered, dragging himself toward the window. His body screamed in protest, but the dog's relentless urgency pushed him forward. With one final heave, Ricardo pulled himself free, collapsing onto the muddy ground outside. Rain pelted his face, mixing with the sweat and grime that clung to his skin. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air. Then he felt it, a warm, wet nudge against his shoulder. He turned his head and saw the dog, its eyes half-lidded but still alert. Ricardo reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against its matted fur. His fingers came away slick with blood. "God, you're a mess," he whispered hoarsely, his chest tightening. The dog swayed, its body giving out. It crumpled to the ground beside him, its breath shallow and uneven. "No, no, no," Ricardo muttered, crawling toward the animal. His hands pressed against its side, feeling the sticky warmth of its blood seeping through his shirt. As he stroked its neck, his fingers found a small metal tag dangling from its collar. He turned it over, squinting at the faint engraving. "Max." Ricardo's breath hitched. "Max," he whispered, the name foreign but strangely fitting. The sirens grew louder, flashing lights cutting through the rain-soaked night. But Ricardo couldn't tear his eyes away from the dog lying motionless in his arms. Blood soaked his shirt, warm and heavy, mingling with the rain. Ricardo sat in the back of the ambulance, the warmth of the blanket they'd draped over him doing little to fight the chill in his bones. His hands shook, whether from the cold or from everything that had just happened. He wasn't sure. Blood, sticky and dark, clung to the front of his shirt, seeping through to his skin. It wasn't his. Max lay motionless on the stretcher beside him, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The paramedics worked quickly, pressing gauze against the wounds that had left the dog's side, torn and matted with blood. "Hold on," Ricardo murmured under his breath, his gaze fixed on the dog. "Just hold on." The ambulance jolted forward, sirens wailing into the night. Ricardo's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the stretcher, his eyes darting to the paramedic. Will he make it?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. The man glanced at Ricardo briefly before returning his focus to Max. "We'll do what we can," he said. The fluorescent lights of the hospital stung his eyes, and the antiseptic smell was sharp, almost suffocating. Ricardo sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his shoulder bandaged and his body stiff with pain. But none of it mattered. Not the cuts, not the bruises, not even the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. "What about the dog?" he asked the nurse for the third time. His voice was sharp, impatient, but underneath it was something else. A desperation he couldn't quite mask. She hesitated. "The vets are still working on him. You should rest." "I'll rest when I know he's okay," Ricardo snapped. The nurse opened her mouth to say something, but thought better of it, leaving him alone in the sterile room. He rubbed his hands over his face, letting out a slow, shaky breath. Minutes dragged into hours before a knock at the door broke the silence. "Mr. Montero?" Ricardo looked up to see a man in scrubs standing in the doorway. "The dog. Max. How is he?" "He lost a lot of blood, and there's some damage to his back legs," the man said. "But he's stable. With time and care, he should recover." Ricardo felt the air rush out of his lungs, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "I want to see him." Max lay on a padded mat in a quiet corner of the hospital's makeshift veterinary wing. His side was wrapped in bandages, and an IV line trailed from his leg. Ricardo knelt beside him, the sight of the dog's still form twisting something deep inside him. "You're tougher than I'll ever be," Ricardo murmured, his voice low. He reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly before finally settling on Max's head. The dog stirred faintly, one eye cracking open just enough to meet Ricardo's gaze. A faint wag of his tail tapped against the mat. "That's it," Ricardo said, his throat tight. "Just hang on. We're not done yet." For the next 2 nights, Ricardo barely left Max's side. He had the staff bring in a cot so he could sleep in the same room, though he hardly slept. Instead, he sat and watched the rise and fall of Max's chest, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor like a tether to hope. On the 3rd night, unable to ignore the weight pressing on his chest, Ricardo finally broke the silence. "You don't know this, Max, but you reminded me of someone." His voice was quiet, strained, the words heavy on his tongue. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before continuing. "There was this dog. A long time ago. I guess you could call him my first friend. He was a stray, just like you." Max's ears twitched faintly, his gaze fixed on Ricardo, as if urging him to go on. "I was 10. Found him in the alley behind my house. My father. Well, let's just say he didn't think much of things like kindness or loyalty. To him, love was a weakness. And I guess he thought he could teach me the same." Ricardo's hand trembled as he traced a circle on the edge of the mat. "I tried to keep the dog hidden, but my father found out. He said having a pet was a waste of time and a sign of stupidity, called it a distraction. And then..." Ricardo's voice faltered, his jaw tightening. Max shifted slightly, a soft whine escaping him, as if sensing the turmoil in Ricardo's words. "He made me take the dog to the bridge," Ricardo said, his voice barely audible now. "Told me to get rid of it. Handle your mistakes," he said. That's what he called it. A mistake. Ricardo swallowed hard, his throat burning. I couldn't do it. I begged him not to make me, but he didn't care. He just grabbed the dog and threw him over the edge. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut, the sound of the splash and the dog's frantic yelps replaying in his mind. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "I just stood there," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't move, didn't scream, I just watched, and I've hated myself for it ever since." Tears burned at the edges of his eyes, but he blinked them away, his gaze dropping to Max. "You probably think I'm a coward, and maybe I am. But after that, I promised myself I wouldn't get attached to anything. No people, no pets, nothing. Because if you love something, it'll only end up hurt, or worse." Max lifted his head weakly, resting it against Ricardo's hand. The simple gesture sent a jolt through Ricardo, breaking the walls he'd spent decades building. "I didn't save you," Ricardo whispered, stroking Max's fur gently. "You saved me. Twice now. I don't know why you did it, but thank you." Max's tail gave a faint wag, and Ricardo let out a shaky laugh, his tears finally spilling over. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotions. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Victoria Montero arrived at her son's mansion earlier than expected, her heels clicking against the marble floors with the precision of a metronome. She wasn't the sort to linger uninvited, but her presence often carried an air of silent judgment that weighed on a room like heavy fog. Today, that judgment found a new target. As she stepped into the sunlit living room, her sharp gaze immediately fell on Max, sprawled on the plush rug in front of the fireplace. His bandaged side rose and fell with slow, steady breaths, and his eyes flicked open briefly, watching her before closing again. Victoria's lips tightened into a thin line, her disapproval clear. "What?" she asked, her voice clipped. "Is that doing here?" Ricardo, standing by the window, turned at the sound of her voice. He didn't answer right away, his expression unreadable. He crossed the room slowly, his hand resting briefly on the back of the sofa before stopping in front of her. "That," he said, his tone sharp enough to slice through the tension, "is Max." "Max?" Victoria repeated, her voice laced with incredulity. She glanced at the dog again, her perfectly manicured hand gesturing toward him. "Ricardo, you can't possibly think it's a good idea to keep this creature here. Look at it. It's filthy, and who knows what kind of diseases it's carrying. It's not safe." Ricardo's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't speak. When he did, his words were laced with a coldness that could have frozen the entire room. "Since when," he said slowly, "do you care about my health?" Victoria flinched just barely, but enough for Ricardo to notice. She smoothed her jacket, regaining her composure. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "I'm only thinking of what's best for you. That dog doesn't belong in a house like this." Ricardo let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "A house like this," he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean cold, empty, and big enough to echo every damn thought that crosses my mind?" Victoria frowned, her perfectly arched brows knitting together. "Ricardo, I don't have time for your theatrics. I came to check on you to make sure you were recovering and what?" Ricardo snapped, his voice rising. "Tell me, Mother, when was the last time you checked on me? Not my bank balance, not my public image, me." Victoria looked taken aback, but she quickly masked it, her posture stiffening. "I won't be spoken to like this," she said, her tone icy. "Then don't speak to me at all," Ricardo shot back. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint crackle of the fire. Max shifted slightly on the rug, his ears flicking as if sensing the tension. Victoria sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Ricardo," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "You've been through a lot. I'm only trying to help. This isn't like you, to get attached to something like this. It's not practical." Ricardo's laugh this time was quieter, but no less bitter. He knelt beside Max, his hand running gently over the dog's fur. "Maybe that's the problem, Mother," he said, his voice low. "I've spent my whole life being practical, being just like him." Victoria stiffened at the unspoken reference to her late husband. "Ricardo," she began, but he cut her off. "No," he said firmly, standing and meeting her gaze. "Max stays. He's the only reason I'm alive right now. And for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm just existing. So no, Mother, you don't get a say in this." Victoria opened her mouth to argue but stopped, her expression unreadable. She looked at Ricardo for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine," she said stiffly. "Do what you want. You always do." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the floor. Ricardo watched her go, the weight of the conversation settling heavily in the room. Later that evening, Ricardo sat on the floor next to Max, his back against the sofa. The dog lay with his head resting on Ricardo's lap, his eyes half closed in contentment. "You know," Ricardo said softly, running a hand over Max's ears, "she's not a bad person, just set in her ways, always has been." Max let out a low huff, his tail thumping once against the floor. Ricardo chuckled, the sound more genuine than he'd expected. "Yeah, I don't buy it either," he said. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow over the room. For the first time, the mansion didn't feel quite so empty. The days that followed were a slow adjustment for both man and dog. Max explored the vast house with cautious curiosity, his claws clicking against the marble floors as he padded from room to room. Ricardo, unaccustomed to sharing his space, found himself caught off guard by the dog's presence. Whether it was the sound of his breathing at night or the way he always seemed to be nearby, watching him with those steady, knowing eyes. One morning, Ricardo walked into the living room to find Max sitting patiently by the door, a toy ball clutched between his paws. The sight was so unexpected that Ricardo froze, staring at him for a moment before letting out a laugh. "Is that your way of asking me to play?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Max wagged his tail, his eyes bright. "Well, all right then," Ricardo said, picking up the ball and tossing it lightly across the room. Max scrambled after it, his movements clumsy but determined. Ricardo watched him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme of his life, but for the first time in years, it felt like a piece of the emptiness inside him had been filled. As Max trotted back with the ball, his tail wagging furiously, Ricardo reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Good boy, Max," he said quietly. Max leaned into his touch, his eyes closing in contentment. The next morning, Ricardo stood at the head of the sleek glass conference table in the executive boardroom. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows behind him, illuminating the faces of the company's top leaders, all of whom sat in tense, expectant silence. "Let me be clear," Ricardo began, his voice steady, commanding. This company has spent too long focusing on profits at the expense of everything else. That changes today." The murmur that rippled through the room was immediate, a mix of confusion and unease. Ricardo allowed it for a moment before continuing. "We're launching a new initiative," he said, leaning forward slightly, his palms flat on the table. "Effective immediately, we will partner with community organizations, fund social programs, and yes, support animal welfare initiatives. It's time this company stands for more than just numbers on a ledger." The room fell silent again, but this time the tension was palpable. From his seat near the middle, Alberto Montero, his cousin Ricardo's CFO and a man who had long operated with a level of self-assuredness that bordered on arrogance, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Ricardo," Alberto began, his tone clipped. "These kinds of initiatives are admirable, sure, but let's not kid ourselves. They're also expensive. Diverting resources to programs like these could hurt our bottom line, and that's something we can't afford to do." Ricardo turned his gaze to Alberto, his expression unflinching. "Hurt our bottom line?" he repeated. "What's the cost of doing nothing, Alberto? What's the price of being a company no one trusts or respects?" Alberto shifted uncomfortably, but didn't back down. "I'm just saying we need to think this through. The shareholders, Ricardo interrupted, his tone sharp. "Invest in this company because we're leaders. And leadership means more than just chasing profits. If they can't see that, then maybe they've invested in the wrong place." The tension in the room thickened. A few of the executives exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak. Ricardo straightened, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not asking for your approval. This is happening. If anyone here has a problem with that, you know where the door is." He let the weight of his words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "The first phase will involve reallocating funds to establish partnerships with local shelters and community centers. Emilia will distribute the details later today. That's all." He picked up the tablet from the table and strode toward the door, leaving the room in stunned silence. Ricardo's office was a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded in the boardroom. The space was bright, minimalistic, and meticulously organized, a reflection of the man himself. Max lay on a large cushioned bed near the window, his tail thumping lazily against the floor as Ricardo entered. "Missed the show, buddy," Ricardo said, tossing his tablet onto the desk. Max tilted his head, his eyes following Ricardo as he crossed the room. The door clicked open again, and Emilia stepped inside, a folder tucked under her arm. "Well," she said, her tone dry, "that was bold." Ricardo smirked, sinking into his chair. "Bold or reckless?" "A little of both," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "But I'll give you this. It definitely got their attention." Ricardo leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Good. It's about time." Emilia placed the folder on his desk, sliding it toward him. "While you were making waves in the boardroom, I was digging into those transactions you asked me to look at. Turns out you were right. There's something off." Ricardo's demeanor shifted instantly, his easy confidence replaced by sharp focus. "Go on." Several large sums were transferred to accounts linked to a non-profit on paper, but the funds never actually made it to the organization. Instead, they were funneled into a private account, one that traces back to Alberto. Ricardo's jaw tightened. "Alberto," he said slowly, the name hanging in the air like a warning. Emilia nodded. "That's not all. Some of these transactions were signed off by your mother." Ricardo's eyes narrowed. "My mother?" That doesn't make sense. She doesn't involve herself in the day-to-day operations, especially not on financial matters. That's what I thought, Emilia said. But her signature's there. Either she doesn't know what she's signing, or someone's using her as a cover. Ricardo's mind raced. He could feel the familiar burn of anger rising in his chest, but he forced it down, his thoughts sharpening. "Keep digging," he said, "and get me everything you can on those accounts." "Already on it," Emilia said, standing. "But Ricardo, be careful. If Alberto's behind this, he won't go down without a fight." Ricardo nodded, his gaze drifting to the window as Emilia left. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing within the walls of Montero Industries. That evening, long after the office had emptied, Ricardo sat at his desk, sifting through pages of financial reports. Max lay at his feet, his steady breathing a comforting presence in the otherwise silent room. As he flipped through the files, a single detail caught his attention. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but it was there. A discrepancy in the maintenance records for his car. His stomach tightened as the pieces began to click into place. The brake failure hadn't been an accident. Someone had tampered with his car. His pulse quickened, a cold clarity settling over him. He wouldn't let this go unanswered. The next few days, Ricardo sat alone in his office, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a lead blanket. His eyes locked on the glowing laptop screen in front of him, each piece of evidence Emilia had uncovered displayed in chilling detail. Bank statements, transaction logs, names, dates. It was all there, pointing to one undeniable truth. Alberto Montero had orchestrated the attempt on his life. The door creaked open, and Emilia stepped inside, holding a thick folder. She set it on the desk in front of Ricardo, her expression as grim as his own. "That's everything," she said. "The money trail, the call logs, it's airtight." Ricardo nodded, his gaze not leaving the screen. "And the two men he hired?" "They're low-level criminals," Emilia said, sitting across from him. "Petty theft, a few assault charges. They've gone to ground since the attack, but with the logs tying Alberto to their payments, we don't even need their testimony." Ricardo leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly. "He's been stealing from this company for years," he said, his voice low. "Using my mother, using her trust to cover his tracks. And when he thought I might expose him..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Emilia hesitated. "Ricardo, confronting him directly could be dangerous. If he was willing to go this far..." "That's exactly why I'm confronting him," Ricardo interrupted, his tone hard. "He won't get another chance to finish what he started." The meeting was set for the following afternoon, in a conference room away from the usual bustling halls of Montero Industries. The air inside was thick with tension as Ricardo sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. To his right was Victoria, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her presence was a calculated decision. Ricardo needed her to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The door opened and Alberto walked in, his confident stride faltering slightly when he saw who was already seated. "Ricardo," he greeted, forcing a smile. "Victoria, I wasn't expecting this." "Sit down," Ricardo said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alberto hesitated, but complied, lowering himself into the chair opposite Ricardo. He looked between the two of them, his smile slipping. "What's this about?" Ricardo didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the folder Emilia had prepared and slid it across the table. "You tell me," he said coldly. Alberto glanced down at the documents, his brows knitting together. "What is this?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It's proof," Ricardo said. Proof that you've been embezzling company funds for years, using fraudulent accounts, exploiting my mother's trust, and if that wasn't enough. His voice dropped, ice lacing every word. You tried to have me killed. Alberto's face paled, his hand twitching toward the folder before pulling back. That's absurd, he said, his voice rising. Ricardo, you can't seriously think— Don't lie to me, Ricardo snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the room, silencing Alberto. I've seen the records, the payments to those men, the calls made the night of the accident. It's all here, Alberto. You think I wouldn't find out? Alberto's mouth opened and closed, his usual smooth demeanor cracking under the weight of Ricardo's fury. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. This is some kind of mistake. A mistake. Ricardo's voice dripped with venom. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing. The only mistake was underestimating me. Victoria, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, her voice trembling. Alberto, she said, her eyes wide and filled with disbelief. Please, tell me this isn't true. Alberto turned to her, desperation creeping into his expression. Victoria, I swear I would never— Don't you dare, Ricardo interrupted, his voice cutting through Alberto's protests. He shoved another set of documents across the table. These are your signatures, your accounts, your calls. Don't insult her intelligence by pretending otherwise. Alberto's facade crumbled. He slumped in his chair, his head dropping into his hands. I had no choice, he muttered. No choice? Ricardo repeated, his voice rising. You had a choice, Alberto. You chose greed. You chose betrayal. And when you thought I might stand in your way, you chose murder. Alberto looked up, his eyes bloodshot. You don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. If you'd gone through with those changes, it would have ruined everything. The deals, the partnerships, they'd all fall apart. I was protecting what your father built. Ricardo froze, the mention of his father hitting him like a punch to the gut. He leaned back, his jaw tightening. Don't you dare bring him into this, he said, his voice low and dangerous. My father may have built this company, but he didn't make it worth saving. I'm trying to change that. You tried to destroy it. Alberto turned to Victoria, his desperation mounting. Victoria, you have to believe me, he pleaded. I never meant for things to go this far. I was only trying to keep the company afloat. For all of us. Victoria shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. You used me, she said, her voice trembling. You made me sign those papers without telling me what they were for. You lied to me, Alberto. Alberto reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her expression hardening. I trusted you, she said, her voice breaking. You were supposed to protect this family, and instead you tried to tear it apart. Ricardo stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is over, he said firmly. You're fired, effective immediately, and if you try to run, I'll make sure the authorities find you. Do you understand? Alberto looked up at him, his face a mask of defeat. For a moment he seemed on the verge of arguing, but then he slumped back in his chair, nodding silently. Get out, Ricardo said, his voice cold. Alberto rose slowly, his steps unsteady as he made his way to the door. He paused briefly, as if to say something, but when he saw the unrelenting steel in Ricardo's eyes, he thought better of it and left without a word. The room fell silent, the tension lingering like a heavy fog. Victoria looked at Ricardo, her face a mixture of guilt and sorrow. I'm sorry, she whispered. Ricardo met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "It's not your fault," he said quietly, "but we have a lot of work to do." Victoria nodded, and for the first time in years, there was a glimmer of understanding between them. The days following Alberto's departure were a whirlwind of activity. Ricardo wasted no time calling an emergency meeting with his senior management team. As the executives filed into the sleek conference room, the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew this wasn't business as usual. Ricardo stood at the head of the table, a commanding presence that demanded attention. "Let's cut to the chase," he began, his voice firm but calm. "We've uncovered a series of serious ethical breaches within this company, and as of today, we are taking immediate action to rectify them." The room remained silent as Ricardo laid out the details of the corruption that had infiltrated the company under Alberto's watch. He didn't mince words, naming individuals involved and outlining the steps he intended to take to restore integrity. "Effective immediately," Ricardo continued, "anyone found complicit in these actions will no longer have a place here. This company is moving forward, and if you can't align with our vision of transparency and accountability, you're free to leave." A murmur rippled through the room, some faces turning pale, while others exchanged subtle glances of relief. Emilia sat to Ricardo's right, her presence a steadying force as she took detailed notes on the proceedings. Though the purging of bad actors led to a handful of veteran employees being dismissed, it was met with unexpected approval from much of the workforce. For too long, whispers of favoritism and unethical behavior had lingered in the hallways. Ricardo's decisive action signaled a turning point, and for many, it felt like a breath of fresh air. With the immediate crisis addressed, Ricardo turned his attention to fostering a new culture within the company. Gone were the days of rigid hierarchies and sterile office environments. The first major change came in the form of flexible workspaces. Desks became less rigidly assigned, allowing employees to collaborate more freely. Ricardo also approved a pet-friendly policy, much to the delight of his staff. Max, of course, became the poster child for this new initiative, his steady presence a reminder of the company's evolving priorities. At first, the sight of Ricardo walking through the office with Max by his side was met with hushed whispers and wide-eyed stares. This was the same man who had once scorned anything unrelated to profit margins. But now, employees found him pausing to chat, offering a faint smile or a nod of encouragement. It was a small shift, but one that spoke volumes. Word spread quickly. Pictures of Ricardo and Max started appearing on social media, shared by employees and soon picked up by local news outlets. The caption on one particularly popular photo read, "A new chapter for Montero Industries, where compassion leads the way." For the first time in years, Ricardo wasn't just known as a ruthless CEO, he was becoming something more, a leader with heart. Not everyone was thrilled by the changes. A faction of major shareholders raised concerns during a quarterly meeting, questioning whether Ricardo's new policies were sustainable. One particularly vocal shareholder, a gruff man in his 60s named Mr. Gallagher, leaned forward during the discussion, his brow furrowed. "All this talk of ethics and community engagement is fine and well," he said. "But let's not lose sight of what this company is here to do. Make money." Ricardo met Gallagher's gaze evenly. "And we will," he replied. "But we'll do it the right way. This isn't just about goodwill. It's about building trust with our clients, our employees, and the communities we serve. That kind of trust leads to long-term success. You want results? This is how we get them." Gallagher leaned back, muttering something under his breath, but the room remained quiet. Ricardo had made his point. One peaceful morning, as Ricardo sipped his coffee and watched Max stretch lazily in the garden, an idea began to take shape. He'd spent so much time thinking about how to change his company, but what if he could do more? That afternoon, he called Emilia and Victoria into his office. "I've been thinking," Ricardo began, his tone unusually reflective. "What if we create something bigger than just a company initiative? A place where people and animals can heal together." Emilia raised an eyebrow. "You mean like a center?" "Exactly," Ricardo said, his voice gaining momentum. "A sanctuary for abused animals, for at-risk youth, for anyone who needs a second chance. We call it Nuevo Amanecer, a new dawn." Victoria, seated in the corner, looked thoughtful. "It's ambitious," she said, "but I think it's exactly what we need right now." With their encouragement, Ricardo dove into the project headfirst. He reached out to social organizations, including local animal shelters and youth programs, forming partnerships to bring the vision to life. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine excitement, not for profit margins, but for the impact this project could have. Funding the project proved to be a significant challenge. The initial cost estimates far exceeded what Ricardo had anticipated, and several potential investors hesitated to commit. One evening, after a particularly frustrating meeting, Ricardo sat in his office, staring at the budget projections. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on Ricardo's shoe. "You don't care about any of this, do you?" Ricardo said, scratching behind Max's ears. "All you want is for me to throw that ball again." Max wagged his tail, and Ricardo couldn't help but smile. The next morning, Ricardo made a bold decision. He would personally invest a significant portion of his own assets into the project. If he believed in it, he reasoned, others would too. At each funding pitch, Ricardo brought Max along, weaving their story into every presentation. He spoke about the night Max had saved his life, about how the dog had given him a second chance, not just at survival, but at becoming a better man. The tactic worked. Potential donors weren't just investing in a project, they were investing in a story, in a vision. Slowly but surely, the funds began to flow. By the end of the month, the framework for Nuevo Amanecer was in place. Construction crews broke ground on a sprawling piece of land just outside the city, and volunteers from the community began signing up to help. Max became a regular at the site, his presence a source of comfort for the workers. Ricardo often found himself pausing to watch the dog interact with people, a child offering him a treat, a construction worker scratching his ears. As Ricardo stood in the middle of the site one afternoon, surveying the progress, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The day of the grand opening ceremony arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze. The center was abuzz with activity as guests arrived, donors, volunteers, local officials, and families who had already benefited from Nuevo Amanecer's work. Ricardo stood near the main stage, adjusting his tie as Emilia approached. "Nervous?" she asked, handing him a note card with his speech. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not about the speech," he said, "just hoping I don't screw this up." "You won't," Emilia said firmly. "You've already done more than anyone expected." As the ceremony began, Ricardo stepped onto the stage, the applause swelling around him. He took a deep breath, looking out over the crowd before speaking. "This center," he began, his voice steady, "is more than a place. It's a promise that second chances are real, that healing is possible, and that no life, human or animal, is without value." He paused, his gaze drifting to Max, who sat at the edge of the stage, his tail wagging gently. "There's someone here today who taught me that," Ricardo continued, his voice softening. "A dog who reminded me that love doesn't ask for perfection. It just asks for a chance. The crowd erupted into applause as Ricardo gestured toward Max. Children rushed forward to pet him, their laughter filling the air as photographers captured the moment. After the ceremony, Ricardo stood with Victoria and Emilia, watching the festivities unfold. For the first time in years, the tension that had once defined their family was gone. "I'm proud of you," Victoria said quietly, placing a hand on Ricardo's arm. Ricardo looked at her, his expression softening. "Thanks, Mom," he said. "That means a lot." As the day wound down, Ricardo found himself alone with Max on a quiet hill overlooking the center. The lights from the buildings cast a warm glow, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted on the breeze. Ricardo sank onto the grass, resting a hand on Max's head. "We did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you believe it?" Max leaned into him, his eyes closing in contentment. News of the center spread quickly. Journalists arrived to cover the story, drawn by the compelling narrative of a hardened CEO transforming his company and his life. Articles detailed the center's mission, the unlikely inspiration behind it, and the stories of those it helped. One piece in particular, published in a widely read magazine, featured a photograph of Ricardo sitting on a bench with Max resting his head on Ricardo's lap. The caption read, "The man who found redemption in a dog's eyes." Ricardo wasn't comfortable with the attention. It felt strange to see himself painted as some kind of hero, but he couldn't deny the positive impact it had. Donations poured in, partnerships with other organizations flourished, and most importantly, other businesses began to take notice. Executives from across industries reached out, asking for advice on how to replicate the model. Ricardo took their calls, not out of obligation, but because he saw the potential for something greater. If more places like Nuevo Amanecer could exist, the ripple effect could be immense. Not everyone was supportive. A handful of Ricardo's competitors began to criticize the project, accusing him of using philanthropy to distract from past missteps or to bolster his personal image. One particularly scathing op-ed accused him of hypocrisy, questioning whether his transformation was genuine. The words stung more than Ricardo cared to admit, but he refused to let them derail his focus. In an interview addressing the criticism, he spoke plainly. "They're not wrong," he said. "I've made mistakes. I've hurt people. But if I spend the rest of my life trying to make things right, that's not hypocrisy. It's accountability." The statement resonated deeply with readers, further solidifying public support for Ricardo and the center. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ricardo walked the grounds of Nuevo Amanecer, with Max trotting beside him. The air was cool and quiet, the sounds of the day fading into a peaceful hum. As they passed one of the enclosures, Ricardo paused, leaning against the fence. A small group of children sat inside, their laughter mingling with the playful barks of puppies tumbling over one another. He turned to Max, who sat at his side, watching the scene with calm, knowing eyes. "You did this, you know," Ricardo said softly. "None of this would have happened without you." Max tilted his head, his tail giving a slow, steady wag.